Hi, everybody. It's Monday night, and this is Joe Firestone, and I'm here with the In Depth Show. Hope you're all well tonight. I'm feeling very fine. Thank you. Hi, Greg. I'm so glad you're back and just about to get out of FB jail. And Kay, hi, how are you? Nice to see you. And Dale. Dale Weaver. You guys hear the city of Pensacola, Florida was cyber hacked today on top of the shooting there the other day. Worrisome for sure. Yes, it is. GM Shower says, "Hi Joe, how are you?" Hi GM, how are you? Randy Hedgerbeth has joined. Nice to see you, Randy. Thank you for coming. And Lana, hi Lana. It's great to see you. Dolores, really nice to see you as well. Thanks for coming. Okay, so the topic for tonight is what will replace zombie neoliberalism? So there's the idea that as an ideology for activism, that neoliberalism has run its course and that it is now dead. But even though it may be dead as an ideology that anybody actually believes in, it can still be very, very damaging. And the reason why it can is that people can still act according to the ideology. They can still uh, they still can use it to justify the most horrible actions. Uh, it still arms the right wing, and the question we all have to face is what do we on the left have to replace it with? So let me ask that question. Well, first, let me check and see how my sound is. Are there any echoes at this point? And Suzanne Ryan is here. Hi, Suzanne. Nice to see you. Dale says, sounds fine here, Doc. Thank you, Dale. I'll take that as gospel and I'll go on. The first article I want to put you on to today is from Social Europe. And the title of it, is Interregnum or Transformation. The article was written by Sherry Berman, who was a professor, at Barnard College. Uh, and you can see the subtitle here. Oh, well, let's check out the title for, yes. Okay, so the summary line is that Sherry warns that, however self evident the crisis of this neoliberal phase of capitalism may appear, it will not automatically collapse. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that it's not automatically collapsing, is it? It says over recent years, the negative consequences of neoliberal capitalism. That's always a very popular way to start, okay, for an academic. Over recent years, or in recent years, right? The negative consequences. I mean, I did that myself a lot of times. Negative consequences of neoliberal capitalism have become impossible to ignore. It contributed to such traumatic events as the 2008 financial crisis, as well as such destructive long term trends as rising inequality, lower growth, increasing monopsony, and growing social and geographic divides. Okay, and okay, also basically, monopsony is a term that refers to a market in which there is only one buyer and there are many sellers. So she seems to be saying that we're increasingly seeing a situation where the governments in each nation, the buyers, and there are many sellers. So the governments are getting very good deals. I'm not sure I'm seeing that happening, but that's another question. Maybe she's referring to something else, but that's what it usually means. In growing social and geographic divides. Moreover, its impact has not been limited to the economic sphere. These events and trends have negatively influenced Western societies and democracies as well. As a result, damning critiques of neoliberal capitalism by academics, politicians, and commentators have actually proliferated. Could have said spread right there, but chose to use a $5 word instead. Yet, if the aim is not to chip away at the rough edges of neoliberalism, but rather fundamentally to transform it into a more equitable, just, and but also productive system, more than a recognition of its flaws and downsides is necessary. As the old saying goes, quote, you can't beat something with nothing, unquote. So then she highlights a two-stage process. If we want to understand what it would take to get rid of the neoliberal ideas and policies which have negatively affected Western economies, societies, and democracies for decades, we need to recall how ideological transformations occur. The rise and fall of economic paradigms or ideologies can be conceptualized as a two-stage process. And she's going to do that for us. In the first stage, dissatisfaction with or recognition of the inadequacy of a dominant ideology grows. These perceived failings create the potential, what political scientists refer to as a political space for change. But even when such a space has opened, the question remains of whether another ideology, and if so, which, will replace the old one. For an existing ideology to collapse, things must actually progress beyond the stage where it is criticized and attacked to a second stage where a new, more plausible and attractive ideology rises to replace it. This, I think, is a bit oversimplified. I think the second stage, if we look at the first stage as basically the stage where people all come to realize that the ideology that governed things has failed, okay, is bankrupt. That we therefore have a problem of understanding our society and how to act in ways that are going to benefit it. Then, okay, in the second stage, uh, we're going to come up with most probably a series of alternative proposals, a series of alternative forms of ideology, which then vie with each other for being the one that is accepted as the solution to the problem of the failure of the old ideology. Anyway, she goes on and she says this process is clearly reflected in the rise of neoliberalism itself. And so she goes back to that time when we saw the rise, okay, of neoliberalism. During the post-war period, a social democratic consensus reigned in Western Europe. This rested on a compromise. Capitalism was maintained, but it was a very different capitalism from its early 20th century counterpart. After 1945, the governments of Western Europe promised to regulate their markets and protect citizens from capitalism's most destabilizing and destructive consequences via a variety of social programs and public services. For decades, this order worked remarkably well. In the 30 years or so after the Second World War, Western Europe experienced its fastest ever economic growth, and liberal democracy became the norm across the region for the first time. Beginning in the 1970s, however, this order began running into problems. As a nasty combination of rising inflation, increasing unemployment, and slow growth, stagflation, spread across the Western economies. These problems created the potential, created a political opening for change. But for this to be exploited, a challenger was needed. That challenger, of course, was neoliberalism. Okay, now, actually, depending on the part of the world, okay, that you were in, there were other challenges. Okay, at the time, there was communism, okay, of the Russian variety, okay, and the Cuban variety, and communism of the Chinese variety as well. Okay. There was also democratic socialism not based on Keynesianism. That was one of the alternatives during the 1970s. But the underpinnings, okay, of democratic socialism at that time during the 1970s were not really very clear, because the dominant form of economics was Keynesianism, and Keynesianism, as people knew it at that time, had apparently failed because the stagflation phenomena of increasing unemployment coexisting with inflation seemed to be a decisive kind, okay, of refutation of Keynesianism. that condition seemed impossible under Keynesianism. And the Keynesians of the time had a tough time trying to explain it and a tough time but trying to get the governments in Western countries to do anything about stagflation that was not consistent with simply tightening up, okay, on interest rates and cutting back, okay, on government spending. And this was leading to many hardships for Western economies at that time. It also led to cutbacks, okay, in government spending across the Western world. And so it seemed as though democratic socialism at that time was not very competitive as an alternative to Keynesianism, okay, which was being practiced in the form of social democracy. There were powerful voices, persuasive ones, though, that were touting the fundamentalism of the markets and the major principles, okay, of neoliberalism. And among them were two clever politicians who were able to appeal to people and who were able to persuade them. And they were Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan here. And their victories during the late 1970s and the early 1980s, and their control of their governments, led to neoliberalism becoming the dominant form, okay, of ideology. They reinforced the strength of that particular form, okay, of ideology, and they greatly weakened the attractiveness of both social democracy and also democratic socialism. The initial seeming success of the neoliberal right further reinforced the political power of those who believed in the ideology, okay, of neoliberalism, and further reinforced, of course, their continuing control over increasing wealth and how it would be distributed in the economies of the West. Now, that was not going on all over the world, of course. Something entirely different was happening in China, okay, in those years, which of course were rather extreme years, but for China. But during the 90s and the following decades, China cast off the more extreme forms of its particular ideological system and began to become extremely successful, but not, of course, with a form of democratic socialism but with a form, of communism that was increasingly mixed with private sector experimentation and growth of the private sector. Anyway, to go on with the article. During the post-war decades, a neoliberal right had been thinking about what it saw as the downsides of the social democratic consensus and what ought to replace it. These neoliberals didn't gain much traction before the 1970s, since the postal order was working well and there was accordingly little demand for fundamental change. When problems and discontent actually emerged, however, the neoliberals were prepared, not only with critiques, but with an alternative. As Milton Friedman, intellectual godfather of this movement, put it, quote, only a crisis, actual or perceived, actually produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. That the left, at the time, was unable to offer distinctive explanations for or viable solutions to the problems facing the social democratic order eased the triumph, of neoliberalism. I think that right there is a pretty good analysis, but it doesn't really go into in some detail why the alternative of democratic socialism did not have ideas that were lying around that were actually attractive to people. Remember, there were certain people around the world, Tony Benn in England, Bernie Sanders here, and various philosophers as well, who continued to adopt and to formulate a socialist paradigm, one that was distinct from the communist alternative, and the one that was distinct from social democracy, as well. But those ideas were never triumphant. It was neoliberalism that was. And maybe here's why. That triumph was also facilitated and cemented by a purposeful process of ideological diffusion. Central precepts, of neoliberalism became widely accepted within the economics profession. And think tanks and educational programs helped to spread the ideas, of neoliberalism, spread them across the policy-making, legal, and other communities. Excuse me a second. Yes, the money neoliberal supporters had, while the government was cutting back, increasing amounts of money were falling into the hands of neoliberal supporters. And it was the money that greased the skids for the acceptance of neoliberalism within economics. And that allowed the think tanks and the educational programs to expand, so that they could spread the neoliberal ideas across the policy-making, the legal, and other communities. So pervasive and effective was this process of diffusion that it swept over parties of the left as well. Yes, you could see this here in the United States when increasingly the ideas, okay, of neoliberalism are accepted by the new Democrat movement here in this country, and increasingly by labor in England, and increasingly by the internationalists trying to bring the EU together. Stephanie Mudge has shown that by the end of the 20th century, the Keynesian economists who dominated economic policy making within most of the left parties during the post-war period had been replaced by transnational, finance-oriented economists, quote unquote, and products of neoliberal think tanks who viewed themselves as interpreters of the markets and saw their mission in technocratic efficiency terms, urging the left to embrace globalization, deregulation, welfare state retrenchment, and other reforms. In the years leading up to the 2008 crisis, voices robustly opposed to the reigning neoliberal ideology were few and far between. Okay, as Marianne Fourcade and Sarah Babb put it, during this period, the triumph of neoliberalism, quote, as an ideological force, unquote, was complete, quote again, in the sense that there were no alternatives simply because everybody believed this and acted upon the neoliberal beliefs. Yes, Maggie Thatcher's slogan was, "There is no alternative. There is no alternative to the market. There is no alternative to individualism, okay, of a radical sort." And so Tina became the dominant slogan of the time. Only recently have we begun to replace Tina with a new alternative slogan, specifically TIAA. There is an alternative. TIA, there is an alternative. And now Sherry Berman moves to characterize things in terms of a pendulum swing. I don't know if that particular analogy is apt, because it seems to be the left-right swing. But what we're having here, of course, is changing paradigms. The financial crisis and growing recognition, she says, of the negative long-term consequences of neoliberalism have now caused the pendulum to swing back. I would say have now caused the neoliberal paradigm to fail. Okay, and the philosophy of the market, okay, and of the necessity of the free market, and of the fundamentalism of the free market have again caused that particular philosophy to fail. Okay, why do I say again? Because that was the dominant philosophy going into the 1930s, after the period of the 1920s. In the 1930s, it was the market, the market, the market. It was always the market. It was always faith in the market, faith in the private sector, no faith in the government. Well, the market god failed people during the 1930s due to the Depression. And the same thing has happened now due to the crash of 2008 and the long recession, the Great Recession, which may better be known as the Long Depression, which followed that. Because, as R.J. Eskow has said, it has really been a long depression for many, many people in the economy. After a few years, the recession may have ended in the sense that the economy began to turn upward again. But it took some years for the economy to get back to the place where it was in 2008. I don't believe it did so until 2015 or 2016. It was the longest recovery in history, and too many were left out of that particular recovery. So once again, to go on with the article, a broad appreciation that many ideas and policies advocated by neoliberals since the 1970s are responsible for the economic, social, and political mess in which the West finds itself has opened the political space for transformation. Yes, that's quite true. So I don't know that it was a pendulum swinging back, but a political space for change appearing again. In history, we have repeated instances of political spaces opening up again because people recognize there are problems that the dominant ideology can no longer speak to, that it can no longer solve. Now, we know what those problems are. We know it's the problem of increasing privatization and maldistribution of wealth and maldistribution of income. We know that insofar as the United States is concerned, it's the unwillingness to move to a Medicare for All program or even farther to a national health service. That's a problem because the market-based insurance system cannot serve far too many people. It destroys them. It destroys their well-being. And then finally, there is the mess that has been made by neoliberalism and the forces of neoliberalism in even recognizing the dangers of climate change. I mean, this is awful. It is a crisis we have never faced before, a crisis that threatens the existence of human beings and maybe the existence of most of the animal life on Earth. It is absolutely terrible. It is an utter failure of neoliberalism. A far worse failure than was suffered by social democracy in the 70s. That caused some hardship. It caused inflation. It caused all kinds of discomfort in the economy, the world economy, as well. But it did not threaten human existence. Anyway, go on with the article. But for the political change to occur, for the transformation to occur, the left would need to be ready with an alternative, not just criticisms. It is entirely possible for growing numbers of people to become aware of problems with an existing order, weakening it perhaps, but not yet causing its collapse and replacement. Indeed, such periods have names, interregnums. Historically, interregnums fell between the reign of one monarch and the next, lacking strong, uh, legitimate leaders. Such periods were often unstable and violent. The period between the dynasty in Old Russia, whose last Tsar was Ivan the Terrible, gave way to what is called the time of troubles, okay, in Russia, when rulership was very unstable, which only ended when the Romanovs took over, if I recall correctly, after a period of 15 years, okay, of utter chaos in Russia. In England, okay, there was an interregnum when the dynasty, okay, the Plantagenets fell, and the Yorkists, okay, and the Lancastrians fought for control, okay, of England. And where there was chaos, okay, in England, till Henry VII was successful in establishing a new dynasty, the Tudor dynasty. So that was, okay, interregnum for quite a few years, marked by lots and lots of violence, okay, and instability. And then there were the times of troubles when the Catholics and the Protestants in England started to fight, and the fights broke out, okay, into open warfare between the two groups. Okay, and when the monarch was dethroned, okay, and executed, actually. And then you had the interregnum of Cromwell, okay, and the Protestants, which ended with the calling back of the Stuart kings to run England, but only after a very bloody period. And there are many other interregnums in history that we can talk about. But okay, an interregnum, to summarize this, is an uncomfortable time when an old order is crumbling, but a new one has not taken its place. Just as in the past, however, such periods tend to be disordered, okay, and volatile, or as Antonio Gramsci more poetically put it, reflecting from his prison cell in 1930 on how fascism, rather than the left, had been the beneficiary of the crisis of capitalism in Italy. During interregnums, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Yes, we're seeing many morbid symptoms in Latin America now, specifically Bolivia. Really morbid symptoms in Bolivia. Since the United States helped the extreme right in that country to take over the government. Morbid symptoms in Colombia. Morbid symptoms in Chile. Morbid symptoms in Venezuela. But there, the morbid symptoms are more due to the interventions of the United States and the sabotage of the United States rather than to the actions, of the Venezuelan government itself. But the fact is, there is an interregnum there. The dominant ideology, which was one of democratic socialism there, has been weakened because it never replaced the right wing in Venezuela properly. Even through all the years the Chavistas controlled Venezuela, they never managed to transform the political and social and economic system sufficiently to get rid of the right wing, most probably because of the dependence of the country on oil and on the dollar. But anyway, Venezuelan politics going through them, it's a complex story beyond my scope here. Whether the many morbid symptoms, quote unquote, economic, social, and political characterizing our current age will be transcended depends on whether the left is able to move beyond attacking neoliberalism it has to come up with and then build support for viable, attractive, and distinctive alternatives. And the big question that I want to raise here now is, are we doing that? Can we do it? And are we doing that? And that brings me to the second of the articles that I want to go over tonight. That's one that appeared in Common Dreams on Friday, December 6th. And it was written by John Quealy, another staff writer at Common Dreams. The title is calling him only 2020 candidate whose plan can, quote, can save our planet, unquote. U.S. youth climate strike leaders endorse Bernie Sanders for president. Not a surprise. Bernie Sanders has the young folks in strong support of his candidacy. As Senator Bernie Sanders stood with activists striking for climate in Iowa on Friday morning. The act of solidarity was repaid in kind later in the day as key leaders of the youth-led movement in the U.S. officially endorsed the Vermont senator's 2020 presidential bid. And a quote from Isra Hersey. It was part of the U.S. youth climate strike. Quote, historically, movements have had young people at the forefront, and the climate movement is no exception, Hersey said. Quote again, Bernie has been there since day one, fighting alongside all the young people across the country. As youth members of the Sunrise Movement targeted Democrats who have refused to endorse the Green New Deal with sit-ins nationwide on Friday, Sanders joined climate strikers near the Capitol building in Des Moines to bolster their demand for bold action on the crisis that is impacting people around the world, including rural regions in the United States. Quote, "You're seeing planting seasons decline and harvest decline because farmers cannot grow crops when their fields are underwater or when they have drought," unquote. Sanders told the crowd of young people and allies. Quote, "We're looking not only in Iowa, not only in the Midwest, not only in America, we're looking all over the world about a serious crisis in food production," unquote. Sanders said. Quote again, "That's the bad news. But here is the good news. If we have the courage to take on the fossil fuel industry and other special interests, if we have the courage to pass a Green New Deal, we can create up to 20 million good paying jobs transforming our energy system." And who's going to create those jobs? In Bernie's view, those jobs are going to be created through government intervention, through the Green New Deal program, and through the Job Guarantee program that will be implemented as part of the Green New Deal program. In this vision, it's not the private sector that is going to help us solve the climate emergency. It's going to be the federal government, it's going to be the local authorities, it's going to be local stakeholders, with local governments having a very strong part in it, and with federal funding creating these up to 20 million good paying jobs. And it's also going to be done with the help of the unions that are going to allow people who have the new jobs to unionize in order to sustain the push towards living wage jobs for all people over a period of time. And what is the ideology that underlies all this? Well, for Sanders, it is democratic socialism, but an updated democratic socialism. One that doesn't accord with classical Keynesian theory of the 1970s. One that rejects that particular theory. And that uses a new economic foundation, not talked very much about yet by people within the Sanders campaign, or even by Sanders himself publicly, but occasionally nodded to by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others allied with Bernie Sanders. And the economic foundation of this new movement towards democratic socialism is likely to rely very heavily on the modern money theory view of the world, the MMT view of how the political economy works. And make no mistake, it's not simply the economy, but from the MMT point of view, it's the political economy that counts. And the political economy, though not explicit, in MMT, but getting strong support from it. That political economy will be governed by democratic socialism, with its concern for the future, concern for collective effort, concern for public purpose, and concern for safeguarding the new and better world that will be created by democratic socialism, utilizing the economic foundations provided by the MMT movement. Going on with the article. Along with local youth climate leaders, Sanders addressed the need for a broad and bold vision to address the emergency and applauded those around the globe rising to demand action. Quote, young people all over the world, not just here in Iowa, in the United States, but all over the world are telling their leaders, quote, hey, we want a planet that we can grow up in and have kids in that is healthy and habitable, unquote. Okay, and unquote, double unquote. Sanders said, okay, at the Des Moines event, and quote again, when that global movement spreads, maybe, just maybe, we can tell world leaders all over the planet that instead of spending 1.8 trillion a year on weapons of the mass destruction designed to kill each other, maybe we can pool our resources and combat our common enemy, which is climate change, unquote. And Bernie tweeted, I'm proud to stand with young people in Iowa and around the world today in their climate strikes. This is about the future of the planet, and we won't accept a middle ground approach. We need a green New Deal. And let me ask you, let me ask everybody, when does neoliberalism talk about the future of the planet? When does it ever talk about the future of the planet? The answer is neoliberalism won't even talk about it. The central problem of our time and neoliberalism is so bankrupt as an ideology, it won't even talk about it. It largely denies that the problem, apparent to nearly everybody, even exists. When it does acknowledge its existence and acknowledges that something has to be done, it talks about solutions that will take far too many years to implement. It talks about solutions that are not solutions because they will leave us all to die. It is the most bankrupt of ideologies. Later on Friday, several leaders of the U.S. Youth Climate Strike Group, namely co-founder and partnerships director Isra Hersey, also executive director Felicon Charlemagne, also political director Padelon Prochaska, and creative director Pujan Patel, all stepped forward to officially endorse Sanders for president. Quote, historically, movements have had young people at the forefront, and the climate movement is no exception, unquote, Hersey said. And quote again, Bernie has been there since day one, fighting alongside all the young people across the country. Yes, I think he's been there since day one because he was there before day one. because he's always been there since he came into politics, fighting for all the people in this country, and the young people especially. Sanders' plan for a Green New Deal, added Charlemagne, quote, is the only plan that addresses the climate crisis to the scale it needs to be addressed. It is the only plan that sets our goals to 2030. It is the only plan that has such a consideration of climate, the climate migrants. The only plan that has such a consideration of climate justice. It's the only plan that can save our planet. Sanders' Green New Deal has been heralded by climate experts as the gold standard among those currently running for president, with a goal of reaching 100% renewable energy for electricity and transportation by no later than 2030. His campaign says the proposal aims to ensure, quote, justice for frontline communities, and vows to build on the organizing and demands set forth by the climate justice movement that gives a priority to young people, workers, indigenous people, and communities of color. Quote, when Bernie talks about this being a global crisis where we need to come together as one planet, this is what he means, unquote. But Pujan said, quote again, a grassroots movement where the working class stands up and tells the government that we have a say and that we deserve to survive. Meanwhile, Sunrise activists who have championed Sanders and other lawmakers leading the charge in Congress, but said those standing in the way, whether President Donald Trump or other Republicans or Democrats, still downplaying the need for urgent action, can no longer be tolerated. Quote, we need a Green New Deal. All these other watered-down ideas are a waste of time, unquote, said Wally Mazon, 25, a Sunrise organizer in Iowa. Quote, when my people from the LGBTQ community are under attack, when people can't get health care, when people can't vote, I can no longer live in a world of apathy on the part of our government. The Green New Deal is about fighting for the world we should be living in, but was stolen from us by a handful of greedy people, unquote. According to Sunrise statement early Friday afternoon, sit-ins were underway at the offices of Representative Axne in Ohio, Governor Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, Representative Chris Pappas in New Hampshire, and the Asheville City Council in North Carolina, with more to come throughout the day. The young people also die-ins and banner drops in major cities, including Chicago, San Francisco, and Houston. With the United Nations climate talks at the COP25 conference taking place in Madrid, Spain this week and next, there were massive Fridays for future protests across Europe and elsewhere. In Madrid itself, an estimated 500,000 people rallied in the streets. In a tweet on Friday, Sunrise's executive director, Varshini Prakash, said, quote, Big Oil wants us to believe we're too young, that we can't win, that we're powerless. Because for every person disillusioned, despairing, and in denial, that's another dollar in their pockets. We won't give that to them. We are rising. The young people will win a Green New Deal, unquote. That's the movement. That's the movement that is growing. And it is necessarily going to be a democratic, socialist movement, because there's no way this can be done without actually giving government participation and government action its due, because the private sector alone, operating according to the rules of the market, the broader market, or operating according to the rules of the stock market, cannot possibly take the collective action we need to match the scale of the climate problem. So, next, what happened in Iceland? In an article called Iceland Fights Climate Change the Same Way It Beat the Banking Crisis, that very beautiful photo of the results of the climate emergency. This article was written by Alex Kirby of the Climate News Network, published in Truthdig on, what was it, December 4th? Yeah, December 4th. So it's 5 days old now. Haven't been able to get to it. I'll put it on clearly now so you can see it better. What can you do if you're a smallish island in the North Atlantic with a lot of snow and a melting economy? Quite a lot, it turns out, if you're prepared to put local people's needs first. You're prepared to put public purpose first. Iceland was hailed recently for erecting a memorial plaque to one of its most striking features. By Akjokul. I'm sure I did not pronounce that correctly, since I don't know Icelandic, which shrank so drastically. Okay, I do know that's a glacier, because of climate breakdown, that it lost its status as a glacier. It was the first in Iceland, okay, to do so, and it's now known fittingly by a diminutive as OK. Barely 10 years ago, when the country was in the grip of a different crisis, the Great Recession, the pace of its far from glacial response showed how quickly rapid changes of government policy can turn a crisis around. Iceland was at the heart of the global financial crisis in late 2008 and was nearly destroyed by it. 97% of its banking sector collapsed in just 3 days. Its three largest banks, the Glitnir, Kaupthing, and Landsbanken, had accumulated a debt of $85 billion, $66 billion, I think that's the symbol for pounds, equivalent to 10 times the country's national income, GDP, or 20 times the national budget. These losses amounted to $330,000 for every man, woman, and child on the island. The stock market then collapsed, with huge numbers of businesses going bankrupt. Iceland approached the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for emergency aid, the first Western country to do so since 1976, and obtained a loan of $2.1 billion, or 1.4 billion pounds. So how did it manage to survive? First, it allowed a default on the $85 billion in debt accumulated by the banks. A new national mood set in, creating lasting conditions for change and the desire for new economic approaches. Other countries had largely let the banks off the hook, like, of course, the United States, But in 2015, Iceland's Supreme Court upheld convictions against bankers at the heart of the crisis. Finance is now so sensitive that when the prime minister was caught up in the revelations from the release of the so-called Panama Papers, he was forced from office. The debts are now largely paid off, but most multinational businesses have left Iceland for fear of the capital controls. The huge expansion in tourism has rescued the nation's economy, though average wages are now much lower. The government protected Icelanders' bank deposits and forgave debts for a quarter of the population. Gee, imagine if that had happened here in the United States, what prosperity we would have now. As Bloomberg News reported in 2012, quote, Iceland's approach to dealing with the meltdown has put the needs of its population ahead of the markets at every turn, unquote. The Rapid Transition Alliance, the RTA, a global initiative which aims to learn from rapid change to address urgent environmental problems, also believes Iceland's way of extricating itself quickly from the global crisis has lessons for other countries, some of which are still paying a heavy price for the events of 2008 and the way they reacted. Contrary to the conventional wisdom that individual countries cannot independently follow radically different economic policy and control capital flows, says the RTA, Iceland shows they can, and quickly. Radical change can usher in a virtuous circle by becoming a habit. Once you've started, new opportunities may open up for yet more change. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, the alliance says it is possible to put people before the demands of financial markets and still run a successful economy. Citizen engagement and economic reform can go hand in hand. Iceland's economy had thrived on speculative finance. But after the meltdown, rather than making the public pay for the crisis, as the Nobel economist Paul Krugman points out, Iceland, quote, let the banks go bust and actually expanded its social safety net, unquote. Instead of placating financial markets, it introduced temporary controls on the movements of capital to give itself room to maneuver. Following this, a, quote, pots and pans revolution kick-started a process that led to a new citizen-drafted constitution which succeeded in engaging half of the electorate. The constitutional exercise proposed a new approach to the ownership of natural resources for public good, which has had a lasting effect on the country's choices. All its electricity and heat today comes from renewable sources, and transparency has become a central part of Icelandic public life. The RTA thinks there were several key factors that enabled such rapid and fundamental change. The extent to which the economic system was irreparably damaged, the decision by the government to respond to the people's demands and not to those of the banks, and the decision to punish those at fault and start anew. It concludes, it is possible, quote, it is possible that the Icelandic way of governing also played a part because they have a long-standing history of deeply embedded democracy and a culture that discourages hierarchy. Was their natural was their natural reflex to protect the many, rather than the few? Question mark. Unquote. Yes, that was their natural reflex, and that needs to be our natural reflex, and the reflex, okay, of every nation in the world. And that, of course, would be the natural reflex of everyone if they were to accept the ideology of democratic socialism in its modern contemporary form that we are shaping right now ourselves with our thinking and with our policies and with our actions that we are taking right now. And the final article I wanted to touch on, the American Prospect has put out a special issue on the climate emergency and the Green New Deal, and we'll be going over most of the articles, or at least some of the articles that appeared in the magazine shortly as we go to other live streams. But for this one, I wanted to touch on the first article. The introduction was written by Robert Kuttner, a long time person in the progressive movement. In other words, an old guy, written on December 5th, 2019. The former editor of the American Prospect, who in June gave way to Dave Badayan, who's the current editor. But this special issue was edited by Kuttner, I believe, and he's written the introduction. And the article is Green New Deal, the urgent but realism of a radical change. The socially just Green New Deal is far more feasible than skeptics think. As policy and technology, the challenge is the politics. Says Robert Kuttner. In just a few centuries, the human footprint on the earth has devastated other species of plant and animal life. It's on the verge of making the planet uninhabitable for people. The cumulative interaction of assaults on several natural systems has already brought about consequences far more dire than the most pessimistic scenarios of just a decade ago. These include ice caps shrinking, but oceans rising, melting permafrost releasing more CO2 and methane, heat producing still more heat, and climate extremes creating ever more devastating storms and fires. Despite the Paris commitments, greenhouse gas emissions keep increasing rather than diminishing. Unless a drastic reversal happens, we will soon pass the point of no return. Pessimists believe we are already there. Even if we succeed, daily life will have to be very different, though in many respects it can be better. In order to avert even worse catastrophes, a number of improbable events will have to break just right. The United States, where Donald Trump revels in removing restraints on carbon production, will need to elect a radically progressive president and a working majority in Congress. That alone will take a miracle of popular organizing, leadership, and common purpose. The President and Congress will then need to undertake the largest economic mobilization of national resources since the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. Actually, it may even be a larger economic mobilization of national resources than Franklin Roosevelt's. It may prove to be a combination of Roosevelt's in the New Deal and Roosevelt's in the Second World War. That's what it might take. Kuttner goes on, okay, a number of people and groups have used the metaphor of a Green New Deal to describe the scale of the needed effort and the large-scale national, now global solidarity that the New Deal evokes. Our purpose in this special issue of the American Prospect is not to add one more volume to the existing libraries of manifestos and reports, but to demonstrate, okay, that an initiative on the scale required is not only urgent, but practical. That has to mean practical as policy, as technology, and above all, as politics. As we demonstrate in this special report, the needed technologies and strategies exist. The challenge is rallying a national commitment to pursue them. Leadership has to begin in the United States because we are both the worst climate offender as well as the one nation capable of spearheading a global reversal. For a Green New Deal or something like it to end reliance on carbon-based energy, drastically revise how we practice agriculture, end the pillaging of several natural systems and the plundering of natural resources, commit to green infrastructure, broaden and redefine the meaning of prosperity and the good life, as well as pursue a just transition, we will need to square several circles. There are aspects of a Green New Deal that command support from the majority. Infrastructure, jobs, and aid to help localities get to zero carbon, incremental reforms whose cumulative dynamics can turn out to be transformative. First, says Kuttner, conversion to a sustainable economy will require a drastic reduction in the human material toll on the planet. Yet, in a democracy, we're asking citizens to approve such a plan at a time when most American families have already suffered declining living standards over 4 decades. People of color have endured not only continuing discrimination and access to their share of the economy's stunted opportunities, but have often borne the worst of the carbon economy's toxic effects right in their own neighborhoods. So while some environmentalists would plead for an economy of voluntary simplicity and radical, quote, degrowth, unquote, a strategy of urging citizens to accept what will be widely perceived as a decline in living standards would be an impossibly hard sell. Happily, a shift to a renewable and sustainable economy could actually enhance living standards properly understood. Green energy would be cheaper and more reliable. Good public transit can improve convenience and relieve people of the need to use cars on ever more congested streets. Wouldn't you rather have good public transit and be able to read something in books or on your iPads while you're traveling somewhere, rather than having to drive yourself? Now, I've always been biased towards this because I grew up in New York City without a car and reliant on public transportation there, which at the time was very good. I mean, I could get to, let's say, 6th Avenue and 50th Street in about 45 minutes from where I lived in the Bronx, okay, in Pelham Parkway. I had to take a bus, and then I had to take a train, okay, a subway train. Okay. It didn't cost very much. It was fun. And when there wasn't standing room only, I got to read along the way. I always thought, okay, it was wonderful. I always hated it when I finally had to get a car when I was in graduate school out in Michigan. Anyway, a shift to energy efficient and less sprawled housing could be packaged with an increase in the supply of affordable housing. Greener and better public infrastructure would replace current decaying public systems that citizens experience as inconvenient and forever broken. The scale of needed outlay, even under the most expansive scenarios, is far less than that of World War II. Maybe so, but it's for far longer than World War II, when the military spent almost half of GDP. And the more we can make green changes at the level of the entire economy, the less the cost of change falls on individuals. The very process of getting all this done can create millions of good jobs and remind citizens that the good life includes reliable public systems and amenities, as well as increasingly unreliable and often perverse private market systems. In the same way that the original New Deal required significant restraints on capitalism and enlargement of public spheres and spaces, a Green New Deal necessarily constrains corporate capitalism. Virtually all of the predatory assaults on the natural environment have been driven by corporate power, complemented by neoliberal ideology, holding that markets are that markets are efficient. I wouldn't say all the predatory assaults. We have to remember the military. That is, after all, a government institution, and it's one of the worst of the contributors to our climate problems. So I wouldn't say that virtually all of the predatory assaults are driven by corporate power. As Nicholas Stern once remarked, global climate change is history's greatest case of market failure. A Green New Deal necessarily means narrowing corporate power, recovering civic and community life, and reclaiming space for our commons. The term pork barrel has generally been used as a pejorative, meaning wasteful public projects where the politics entails a system of mutual, quote, a log rolling, unquote. You support an outlay for my district, and I will support one for yours. And the result is often bridges to nowhere. When Congress swore off earmarking specific projects for congressional districts, it was generally taken as a virtuous reform. But think again. The original New Deal, as historians Nelson Lichtenstein and Kevin Baker demonstrate in their articles, was a triumph of regional development policy, pork barrel in the very best sense of the term. It spread the wealth around. Indeed, if we had paid more attention to making sure that some prosperity reached regions and people left behind, instead of being concentrated in a few tech and finance hubs, we might not have ended up with Donald Trump as president. When there is regional equity to public works projects, even conservative politicians who don't like federal programs are more likely to put their qualms aside. In Tennessee, right-wing politicians rail against Washington, but nobody proposes privatizing the TVA. Well, Robert, they just haven't got there yet. Not quite yet, but if we continue to have neoliberalism, one day they would get around to privatizing the TVA, just as they want to privatize Social Security and every other thing the government does well, so they can cash in on it. Chattanooga today is a digital center because its public power company offers the nation's cheapest and highest speed internet. Holyoke, Massachusetts is a hub for regional high speed computing because its municipally owned utility offers cheap green electricity. A Green New Deal is a chance to jumpstart regional economic development that is also sustainable. What a wonderful thing, right? The second circle that needs to be squared has to do with speed. Ideally, we should have reached zero fossil fuel extraction and combustion years ago. You bet. If we had followed Jimmy Carter's program and not been derailed by Reagan and by Tina, we might have reached zero fossil fuel extraction and combustion sometime during the 1990s and avoided all the threats we're seeing now. Ideally, all fossil fuel operations should be shut down immediately. We can demand that, but we can't will it into happening. As the lead article by Jeffrey Sachs and the discussion of emerging technologies by Mara Prentice explain, we can in fact get to zero carbon a lot faster and with a lot less economic cost than the naysayers contend, and even faster if we get the politics right. Prentice demonstrates that most of the needed technologies are available now. Our special issue, taken as a whole, shows that a Green New Deal can be achieved. As Jeff Foe's piece recounts, we're asking citizens to trust their government to launch an initiative at a massive scale at a moment when trust in government and in all large public systems is at an all-time low. Today, that mistrust is all too appropriate given the Trump presidency. Yet, as Foe observes, the very process of having highly visible projects that improve people's lives can cumulatively rebuild public trust. Yes, when Franklin Roosevelt took over in 1933, there was not a lot of trust in government at that time. People did not believe in the government and its interventions. They turned to Franklin D. Roosevelt and to the government in desperation because they had nothing else. And we have to realize right now that we're in the same position. Mistrust the government or not, we have nothing else right now because the private sector ain't going to do it. These projects, however, will need to be somewhat front-loaded to demonstrate the benefits in the new administration's first 2 years. Otherwise, a new president with grand promises and scant results could suffer the fate of Bill Clinton, whose party lost a record 54 House seats for Democrats in 1994, until that record was broken in 2010 when Barack Obama's party lost 63 seats. Yes, the neoliberals, Clinton and Obama, major fails because they got no results in the first 2 years. Major fails. Notably, the only Democratic president to avoid that midterm curse was Franklin Roosevelt, who managed to deliver a great deal in his first 2 years. The voters reciprocated by increasing his Democratic majority in 1934 by 9 seats in the House and 9 in the Senate. Boy, Kuttner is so right about that. So right about what happened historically and why. FDR delivered in his first 100 days and in his first 2 years. And by 1934, he was a hero. Barack Obama would have been the same kind of hero if he had delivered a Medicare for All bill early in 2009 and if he had put together a $2 trillion stimulus. A $2 trillion stimulus along lines that were recommended by his economists, instead of hedging everything and watering it down and finally arriving at an inadequate stimulus of $800 billion that may have served to stem the tide of a further recession, but did nothing to bring people out of the recession. That had to wait for a slow recovery, the longest recovery in history. And so the voters reciprocated by seeing to it that Barack Obama's party lost 63 seats in the House and eventually lost the Senate and lost more than 1,000 seats in state legislatures across the country. That's the measure of the political failure Barack Obama was. The challenge is for government to get things done fast, but without running roughshod over the local citizenry. The original New Deal was a mix of big projects led from Washington and completed in record time, mixed with a lot of bottom-up planning. Citizens served on boards of local projects, the WPA, and the rural electrification co-ops. Yet, as any student of Robert Moses knows, this was also a decade when highways and bridges, as well as western dams, wiped out entire communities with no community consent. A Green New Deal needs to engage in bottom-up planning, but without endless delays. As transportation planner and engineer Robert Passwell writes in an original and authoritative piece on why infrastructure investments seem to take forever, the single most important factor causing endless delays in public construction projects is neither citizen involvement nor environmental impact statements, but unreliable stop-and-go funding. The great benefit of the Green New Deal is that it would commit the federal government to multi-year, multi-trillion-dollar financing so that serious long-term planning can take place. A third circle that has to be squared is the connection between radical witness and agitation and the need for policies that can be embraced by the next president and enacted by Congress. The alliance between radicals and liberals is always a complex dance. It took considerable militant organizing by radical industrial unions in the 1930s to build a strong labor movement. Yet that movement required a rendezvous with President Roosevelt to legislate the Wagner Act of 1935, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, and labor's partnership with government during World War II. In similar fashion, we needed civil disobedience on the ground by the civil rights movement of the 1960s to generate the moral outrage that finally pushed President Lyndon Johnson to press Congress to enact the three great civil rights acts of that decade. If anything, the relationship between the climate movement and the needed legislation is even trickier. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Sunrise Movement, when they appropriated the Green New Deal metaphor in 2018, literally dozens of reports and policy papers had already used that label. In fact, I might even point out, I'm certain that I used the Green New Deal, at least in a rhetoric way, calling for a Green New Deal in the early days of the Obama administration and going forward. AOC put out a fairly short schematic policy blueprint that was the most expansive of them all. The value of that initiative was to demonstrate the scale of commitment needed, as well as the intersecting multiple needs. The Sunrise Movement also generated new political energy led by the young demanding action. Yet by including under the Green New Deal banner the entire progressive policy agenda, the AOC version of a Green New Deal also presented a high-profile target. AOC's Green New Deal was attacked by both the right as preposterously grandiose and by the center as utopian and too expensive. When more than 300 economists issued a statement attacking that version of a Green New Deal, it included many moderately liberal economists who had served with Obama including former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen. These attacks did damage when our colleague Stan Greenberg, polled on the popularity of several large-scale progressive policy initiatives, including Medicare for All and free higher public education. Most were net positive. The only issue scoring seriously net negative was a Green New Deal with a net minus 23. Some would conclude from this result that the Green New Deal brand, quote unquote, is hopelessly tarnished for the sin of dreaming big before it has even begun. That even relatively liberal but politicians will avoid it. We emphatically disagree. The New Deal, as Nelson Lichtenstein explains in his article, is the only large-scale public initiative in American history with all of the right, all of the right, all of the right, by resonances. Sorry. Most Americans also have a positive view of the need to move to green renewable energy. The current attacks on a Green New Deal only demonstrate that we have public education work to do, hence this special report. I couldn't agree more. We have to press and press and press on with the Green New Deal. People will buy it. Bernie Sanders will help us to sell it, and people will buy it because they know that if Bernie wants it, he thinks that it's for them, because he wouldn't suggest anything else than something that is for improving their lives. People know that. While liberals always need to be pressed and prodded by radicals, the practical challenge is getting a Green New Deal through Congress. AOC's version of a Green New Deal, HRES 109, has 95 House co-sponsors. Long ago, when enthusiasts told 1952 presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson, quote, "You have the vote of every thinking person," unquote, Governor Stevenson replied, quote, "That's not enough. That's not enough. I need a majority," unquote. I forgot the madam in the middle. As realists, we need to recognize that a majority of the House and Senate have to legislate a Green New Deal, while even some Democrats are far too cozy with extractive industries. The grassroots pressure of a movement on the march can help, and yet some of the initial bills will necessarily be more incremental than we might like, focusing on aspects of a Green New Deal that can command support of the majority, such as infrastructure, jobs, and aid to help localities get to zero carbon. This also evokes the original New Deal, which was not a single grand plan, but a series of initiatives that built more support along the way. The French radical theorists Andre Gorce coined the term non-reformist reform, meaning reforms that seem incremental, but whose cumulative dynamics turn out to be transformational. We need to legislate in that spirit. Economic and racial justice must be built into every aspect of a Green New Deal. Here again, as Harold Myerson's article explains, crisis presents opportunity. Justice is harder in a climate of struggle over a dwindling supply of good jobs and insufficient funds for resilience and remediation. A just transition means good jobs, not just for the mostly white and male workers in the extractive economy, but for people who never got to share in the environmentally ruinous good times, It means special attention and resources for the communities that have borne the brunt of the toxicity. A Green New Deal at adequate scale can provide these resources for all. While we may believe that denial of climate change is limited to oil magnates and Trumpians, it is broader than we think. Mainstream economists keep issuing reports that are ignorant of the science and built on pitifully rosy assumptions. William Nordhaus, the liberal Yale economist who won a Nobel Prize for his work on climate change, uses a model that considers a 3.5 degrees Celsius warming acceptable and projects global economic damages at just 2.1% of GDP. By contrast, the IPCC and most climate scientists view that degree of warming as catastrophic. Nordhaus thinks we can reach that goal purely with the carbon tax of just $44 per ton. The IPCC calculates that a tax required to cap warming at a barely tolerable 1.5 degrees Celsius would have to be at least $135 per ton and as much as $5,500 per ton, depending on what other complementary policies were used. Complacency is also a form of denial. Though the ravages of climate change are upon us in California's fires, ever more intense hurricanes, and in the daily flooding of streets in several southeastern coastal cities, for most Americans, daily life goes on. Okay, and in the middle of something like normalcy, the projections of general catastrophe within a few decades create a form of cognitive dissonance that can also be disabling. Breaking through that denial also requires leadership and education and a sense of a Green New Deal, not as shared sacrifice, but as hopeful, positive possibility. Our closing conversation with Bill McKibben offers something of that hope. That's the final article, of course, in the collection. The prospect's special value is to connect practical policy and social movement to politics in the effort to literally save the planet. What seems utopian has to be understood as actually realism. Radical change is pure realism when it comes to survival, yet it also needs to become realism as politics. If the prospect is good at anything, it is in explaining how the radical can become real. In this special issue, we hope to demonstrate that drastic change is not only urgent but possible. The issue is divided into three parts. Part one discusses infrastructure investment as a key part of the Green New Deal. It reminds us of what the original New Deal did and then lays out what an infrastructure and jobs program needs to be today. But part two addresses the challenge of a rapid shift to a post-carbon economy. How fast can it be done? What are the gross and net costs and the net benefits when measured against the escalating costs of inaction? How do we pay for it? What are the relative roles of different levels of government and citizens? Happily, the pieces by two of the nation's leading economists who study climate, Jeffrey Sachs and Robert Palin, agree that the total new cost of financing a green transition is an affordable 2% of GDP, factoring in costs as well as benefits. Part three is all about the politics. Uh, I'm sorry to say that I think that that particular section should have included, okay, an MMT economist. Both Jeffrey Sachs, okay, and Pollan are economists on the progressive side. But I'm afraid that they would answer the question of how we pay for it in a far different way than the MMT economists would propose. We would give much better and much deeper answers to by that particular question, if given the opportunity. Part three is all about the politics. How do we assemble the majority support to make the utopian thinkable, but then irresistible? And how does the national connect to the global? Our purpose is not to duck the hard questions by putting forth policies that can be defended as, quote, aspirational, unquote, with the politics glossed over, but to look the hardest questions directly in the eye. We cannot fail. As progressives sometimes say, half joking, that if Trump is reelected, there is always Canada. But if we lose this planet as our home, there is no other. We all have to face that. That is why we cannot fail. So that's it. Okay, I'm at 11 o'clock now. I see there are still some of you here. In fact, it looks like the number of you has expanded a little. But I think I've probably overstayed my time. I would like to consider your comments. I think I will spend a few minutes on them just so I can consider them. Let me first, however, remind you to please share, like, and subscribe to this video when it goes up, okay, on YouTube. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Thank you. I will now consider what you've had to say. I'm afraid I'll probably be a little rushed while I do that, but I will do my best to do your comments justice. Kate Clark Ryan says, there have been massive protests all over the world lately of people trying to stand up to the corporate rulers of countries everywhere but in the good old USA. Why is that, do you think? Where are protesters in the streets? I think one reason why the protesters are not in the streets is because in recent years, the example that has been set by the police and by the local governments is that protesters are to be denied their rights to peacefully assemble. Okay, there have been successful attempts to cordon off the protests in city after city, to arrest people in what are certainly unconstitutional and illegal arrests. And so people have had a rough time. I think that our protests have not reached the scale where they cannot be contained by such tactics, okay, at this point. But I also think that even though our militarized police have a considerable degree of power, okay, in back of them, our armed forces today are historically small, though very powerful. Quite a lot of our armed forces are overseas. They're not here in this country. Okay. people do not realize uh, how much power there would be in nearly universal protests, okay, across the country. I don't believe that there are enough of the military police to contain by these protests, and I think there are far few troops here to contain them once they really get going. But we have to face the reality. If we're going to get into the streets, okay, and we're going to protest, some of us are going to pay a very big price, even for nonviolent, entirely legal protests, because we are not going to be faced by legal force and by legal attempts to contain our efforts at free speech, okay, and the free assembly. We will be contained, or the authorities will attempt to contain us through illegal denials of our civil liberties and our civil rights. We must expect that. It's the price we'll have to pay. And Kay says, Bernie is the only one for me. I refuse to vote for another lesser of two evils in my life. If the DNC screws him out of this nomination, they can have the orange idiot, okay, for another term. Well, they've made perfectly clear already they prefer the orange idiot to Bernie Sanders, evidently. I mean, that's the meaning of all their actions that we've seen since the campaign has started. Sanders uses the language of the left, but he is a fraud, okay, and a neoliberal. He's not going to deliver what he promises. Well, that's your opinion, GM Shower. I don't know, okay, if many of us I really agree with that. I certainly don't. But I think that Bernie is for real, and if he is elected as president of the United States, he will be at least as strongly for reform, okay, as Roosevelt was. He will radically change the structure of our system if he gets a working Congress. And if we can't get him a working Congress by 2020, he can run against that Congress and certainly get a working Congress in 2022. Okay, Bernie has never been a neoliberal. I agree with Kay Ryan about that. And GM says the progressives and Democratic Socialists in the Democratic Party are as counterfeit as a $13 bill. Okay, GM, go ahead. If that's what you think, that's what you think. I'm not going to try to dissuade you. Kay Ryan says, GM, are you a Trumper? Laugh out loud. GM says, Bernie has been supporting neoliberals like Bill Clinton since the early 90s. I'll look it up. Don't take my word for it. He's been tactically supportive while doing what he could to undermine the system, okay, of neoliberalism. I believe he might have been, okay, a little bolder at certain times. I believe he gave in too easily when he bargained for community health centers as part of the Affordable Care Act in 2009. I think he should have held out for far more money than he got, okay, in the bill. He should have insisted the price of his vote was $100 billion, okay, in the stimulus bill, okay, for community health centers. He might have made a dent in health. He might have made a dent in the healthcare problem if he had actually gotten that. Also, I don't think he should have ever supported Hillary in 2016 But he may have been right. That has allowed him to come back now in 2020, okay, and to be a serious candidate for the presidency once more. Kay says, I know his history. I've been following him for many years, even before he ran in 2016. You are full of it. You look it up. Folks, it doesn't help to tell people you look it up, okay, and you look it up, okay, you look it up. That actually doesn't work. I don't think arguing over Bernie's history, okay, is going to work. There are many of us who know his history, and while we may regret some parts of his history, we look at the man he is now and the job he is doing now in running this campaign. And what we see, we like, and we believe that he's going to do everything he can to implement the agenda on his website, that whole agenda. And we know that that whole agenda is going to radically change our country and bring the Green New Deal. And GM goes on. GM is one of Dr. Joe's Facebook friends. Looking at his posts is telling. At my posts? Or looking at the GM's posts? I think you mean the GM's posts. Yeah, I have lots of Facebook friends, and I don't agree with all of them. GM Shower says the election is illegitimate. We need to boycott and tear both parties down. The whole process is big money fraud. There's a lot of truth in what you say, GM, but we're trying to change that. And one of the ways in which we can try to change it is by taking part in it and creating an atmosphere where that final cheating in order to deny Bernie the nomination cannot take place without really breaking up the party. Ernest Jones has joined. Kay Ryan says, I'm all for a real People's Party, but we don't have that option this time. Well, if the Democrats should cheat us again when we've clearly won, we may yet have that option this time. Barbara Reed has joined. Lana says he doesn't like anyone. Advocates for not voting. Says all police forces should be abolished. Seems a little out there, quote unquote. Kay Ryan says, I figured something like that. Thank you, Lana, for the info. GM says it's not, quote, out there to tell the whole unadulterated truth. Well, GM, you're telling the truth as you see it, but it is not the truth that most of us see. We see a lot of the shortcomings, okay, that you see, but we do not believe that it is beyond all hope. That, okay, is your belief. And I doubt that you're going to swing us over to your belief by making a few comments here on this stream and on my Facebook page. That is not going to happen. Okay. The kind of change you're looking for, okay, is not going to happen. So, okay, I wonder why you're putting your effort into this. Hey, good night, Russell. Sorry, still trying to get to where the next set of comments starts. Susan Eldridge has joined, and GM says, I hope Bernie wins so you all finally see that he's just another Obama with better acting skills. Nobody has better acting skills than Obama. Certainly not Bernie. Okay, so Kay and GM continue to debate. I'm not sure what GM is trying to accomplish. I'm not going to speculate on the motivations he has, but I don't think he's discouraging any of us. And Charles Lovett has joined, and GM says, I hope Bernie wins so you will finally see that he's just another Obama with better acting skills. Kay says, I hope he wins too so people like you will finally shut up. Susan says, hello. Hello, Susan. Susan says, Noam Chomsky said he is doubtful Bernie will win, and if he does, he won't be able to get anything done because the oligarchy will fight him every step of the way. Very depressing. Well, I respect the contributions, Kay, that Noam has made over the years, but the oligarchy fought with Franklin Roosevelt every step of the way, too. But Franklin won a lot of battles and made major transformations in our society. He was not perfect and he failed, okay, in a lot of areas. But he made the United States a much better place than it was before. And his reforms and the atmosphere that he created were the foundation of the post war prosperity that was enjoyed in the Western world. Kay said, I'm no fan of Obama either. He sold himself as a progressive and then governed with all the corporatists. I saw his game as soon as I saw his administration. I didn't fall off the truck just yesterday. Susan, that is why he always says it's not him, but all of us. Jim Bird joined. GM said, I do not trust the integrity or ethics of any politician that does not support the BDS movement. Sanders not only is against it, but he signed a letter with other politicians actually denouncing the BDS movement. He also did not honor his supporters by protecting the vote in the 2016 primaries. In fact, his supporters that wanted legal action, but through the DNC fraud lawsuit, actually were essentially blown off, okay, by Bernie. Yes, that is true. I mean, all that, but all those facts, okay, and Bernie certainly is a politician, and sometimes he doesn't do the things he ought to do because he's a politician, and he decides against doing the things that he ought to do. He's decided that rather than doing all the things he ought to do, okay, along the way, that he does better to safeguard his chances of actually getting the nomination, changing the Democratic Party, winning the presidency, and changing the nation. And I think whether this view of his, or such a view of his, is justified or not, hangs in the balance. We won't know unless he navigates these difficulties successfully. And even then, we wouldn't be in a position to say that he might not have done it if he had done some other way. But at least we would be able to conclude that he did not do it in the wrong way. Kay points out he had to sign a disclaimer on that to run as a Dem, but even though he's an independent. Yes, Kay, but there I think he could have said that he is no longer bound by the disclaimer because he was cheated in the primaries. In other words, the implicit bargain that was struck actually with the Democrats, okay, is that if he would run as a Dem in a fair primary contest, that he would then have to sign a disclaimer. There was no agreement made that the primary contest could be unfair and could be rigged from day one by the superdelegates. Russ says, I've got to call it a night. This is Hell Week for my trade. See you all again soon. Thank you, Russ. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying so long. Kay says, Night, Russell. I won't be far behind you. GM says, Bernie was not bound by any rules as there were many laws broken by the Hillary campaign and DNC throughout the primaries. It was Sanders' responsibility to take a stand against Katie's illegal acts, but instead he covered for Hillary, with the icing on the cake being him saying the Russians were sabotaging the Clinton run. Nice diversion from fraud in the primaries. Quote, DNC Bernie, unquote. Well, again, GM, there's a lot of truth, okay, in what you say, but still, it may be that Bernie's strategy will prove right if he brings in a progressive Congress with him in 2020, if he has the nomination, and if he's able to win the presidency, and if he goes through with his program. That still seems to people like me to be our best shot in 2020. And we don't have time to build another shot because in 2021, we have to start to reach those 230 targets. We have no more time for the Green New Deal. We have to start getting it implemented now. I hate to think what our alternative would be if Bernie does not win in 2020 or gives up the fight now and just goes somewhere else out of anger because they're trying to rig the primaries again. We all see that. But he has to stick in there and fight on the ground all the way through these primaries. Now, if he's denied if he is actually denied the nomination unfairly and it clearly is rigged, there's good possibility it will happen, then I would say to him at this time, there is no more time left. The Green New Deal has to start in 2021. So you, Bernie, have to take the long shot now. And we have to take the long shot now. And that long shot is that we can elect you as the candidate of the People's Party or as the candidate of the Green Party. That's what's going to have to be the next move if they rig it again. And at that point, he's going to have to void the commitment he has made this time around on grounds that they rigged the primary again. That will be the indicated action in 2020 if things work out in that way. Kay says, in my opinion, the whole plan on the trickle-down economics was to keep people so busy working more than one job, taking care of their kids, etc., was to keep them too busy to fight back with protesting. I think that's some of it. I don't know if that was planned, but it's something that happened. And I'm sure that those in power realize that in the desperate situation many people are in, they don't have time to protest. That's one reason why they're not out there. But eventually, they get so desperate that they don't care, as we see with the Gilets jaunes in France, and as we see with the latest protests in France and elsewhere, as we see in Chile. as we're seeing there. Sometimes people just conclude, we have had enough. We're not going to take this shit anymore. Okay, and a remark, okay, from Evelina. Ponte, radiation contaminates water, land, animal life, and makes people sick. Yes, it does. Okay, says Clinton ruined the best Dem party and Obama wasn't any better. Obama was worse, okay, in many ways, because what Obama did was to dash people's hopes by pursuing neoliberalism. He made a lot of people believe there is no beating them. He made a lot of people as cynical as GM Shower. Okay, and Evelina says, war kills, destroys infrastructure, causes disease and starvation. And Kay says she agrees, and along with it worsens climate change. And GM says only the threat of violence by the masses prodded Franklin Roosevelt to do anything for the people. He did it to save capitalism for his rich friends. He also set up a New Deal in a way so that the wealthy could roll it back over time. Oh, yeah, he really planned that, right? You think Franklin Roosevelt actually planned the rollback of the New Deal over time while he was implementing it. GM, that is a crank theory. Absolutely crank theory. Only a full-blown revolution will get us now what the people at that time really needed, okay, and wanted. Well, that conclusion could be correct, but it doesn't follow from the first few sentences in that paragraph. Kay says, well, it has been good to talk to some like-minded people. I appreciate that. Thank you, Joe, for your info. I'm going to bed. Night all. Night, Kay. And Evelina says, people are starting to say good night. Oh, I see. What Evelina's doing is she is advocating for an anti-war kind, okay, of orientation. I completely agree, and I think you will find that Bernie Sanders becomes the most anti-war president that we have had in a very, very long time. In a very, very long time. So, at this point, I've reached the end of the comments, and I think I've also reached the end of my live stream. And so, I'm going to bid you a happy good night. I will be back tomorrow, most probably with more Green New Deal stuff. How about that? I hope you're looking forward to that. Unless, of course, something strange happens on the political front that I feel a need to comment on. So for now, thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. It's been a long haul, I know. And good night to all. And thank you again.